What would you do if a single act of kindness pulled you into a deadly corporate conspiracy? Thomas, a broke mechanic drowning in medical debt, pulled a dying stranger from a burning wreck. He had no idea this helpless girl was a ruthless billionaire CIO, and someone wanted her dead. The rain in the Pacific Northwest didn't just fall, it punished. On the night of November 14th, it was coming down in sheets across State Route 20, washing out visibility and turning the winding mountain asphalt into a slick, deadly ribbon. Thomas Reed gripped the steering wheel of his rusted 1998 Ford F350 tow truck, his knuckles white. At 34, Thomas looked a decade older. The deep lines framing his eyes were etched by sleepless nights, grueling physical labor, and the crushing weight of a father's despair. His 7-year-old daughter Maya was at home with a neighbor, asleep breathing through a nebulizer. Maya had a congenital heart defect. The surgery to save her life at Seattle Children's Hospital cost $80,000. Thomas had exactly $412 to his name. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was another automated text from Pacific Heritage Bank. Final notice foreclosure. Thomas ignored it, squinting through the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers. He was heading home after a 12-hour shift that yielded a single miserable jump-start job. Then he saw it. It was subtle at first, a fresh, violent tear in the metal guardrail on a sharp, hairpin turn. Most people would have driven right past it in the blinding storm, but Thomas's mechanic eyes caught the unnatural glint of shattered safety glass scattered across the wet pavement. He pulled over the truck's tires, spitting mud, and grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the passenger seat. Stepping out, the icy wind immediately soaked through his worn flannel jacket. He walked to the edge of the ravine, shining the beam down the steep forested embankment. 70 feet below, pinned violently against the massive trunk of a Douglas fir, was a mangled mass of black metal. It was a 2024 Range Rover Autobiography, completely crushed on the driver's side. Smoke and steam hissed from the crumpled hood, mixing with the heavy rain. Thomas didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the muddy embankment, sliding and tearing his hands on sharp rocks and blackberry brambles. As he reached the vehicle, the thick metallic scent of blood hit him immediately, followed by something far worse, the sharp, noxious odor of leaking gasoline. "Hey!" Thomas shouted, slamming his fist against the shattered driver's side window. "Is anyone in there?" No answer. The front cabin was a horrifying accordion of deployed airbags and twisted steel. He moved to the passenger side, finding the door jammed. Adrenaline surging, Thomas wedged his steel-toed boot against the frame, gripped the door handle with both hands, and pulled with a guttural scream. The metal groaned, popped, and gave way. Slumped across the center console was a young woman. She wore a shredded, blood-soaked designer trench coat, her face hidden by a curtain of dark, matted hair. She was unconscious, a deep laceration across her forehead, pouring crimson down her pale cheek. Suddenly, a spark hissed from the exposed engine block. A small orange flame licked the hood. "Come on, come on," Thomas muttered frantically. He leaned in, fighting the twisted seatbelt. It wouldn't unlatch. The fire was growing, catching the spilled oil beneath the chassis. He pulled a pocket knife from his jeans, sawed through the thick nylon belt, and hooked his arms under the woman's shoulders. She was incredibly light, but dead weight is always heavy. Thomas dragged her out of the cabin, falling backward into the mud. He hauled her over his shoulder and began the agonizing climb up the ravine. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but the rising heat at his back forced him upward. They were halfway up the embankment when the Range Rover's fuel tank blew. The shockwave knocked Thomas off his feet, sending them both tumbling into the muddy brush. A massive fireball illuminated the dark forest, throwing terrifying shadows against the trees. Debris rained down around them, hissing as it hit the wet earth. Ears ringing, Thomas pushed himself up. He checked the woman's pulse. It was there, but faint. Thready. He managed to carry her the rest of the way to his truck, laying her across the worn bench seat. He grabbed his CB radio, thumbing the mic. "Dispatch, this is Reed Towing. I need an ambulance at mile marker 42 on Route 20. Major MVA. Vehicle fire." Static crackled back, followed by the dispatcher's stressed voice. "Thomas, negative on the ambulance. The bridge at Deception Creek just washed out. Route 20 is completely cut off from the west. Medics can't get to you, and the storm is grounding all choppers." Thomas stared at the bleeding woman. She wasn't going to make it through the night if she stayed out here. "Understood," Thomas said grimly. "I'm taking her to my place. It's the only shelter on this side of the washout." He threw the truck into gear and sped toward his small, dilapidated cabin in the woods. When he arrived, he carried her inside, laying her on his worn living room sofa. The cabin was cold-heated only by a small wood stove. Maya was asleep in her bedroom, oblivious to the chaos. Thomas went to work. He wasn't a doctor, but he had spent 4 years as a combat medic in the army before Maya was born. He boiled water, tore clean sheets into bandages, and cleaned the vicious gash on the woman's head. As he wiped away the blood and grime, he got his first real look at her face. She was strikingly beautiful, probably in her late 20s, with sharp, aristocratic features that seemed entirely out of place in his dusty, drafty living room. As he removed her ruined coat to check for other injuries, something fell from her pocket. It was a heavy, solid, gold money clip holding a stack of black metal credit cards. The name etched into the titanium read, Vivian Mercer. Thomas didn't recognize the name. To him, she was just a dying girl who needed help. He spent the entire night by her side, monitoring her breathing, changing her bandages, and feeding the wood stove to keep her warm. He gave her the last of his own clean clothes, a grey, oversized hoodie, and prayed she would open her eyes. Vivian Mercer awoke to the sound of a child coughing. It was a wet, rattling sound that tore through the quiet morning. Vivian's eyelids felt like they were made of lead. A blinding, throbbing pain radiated from her skull. She tried to move her arm, but her muscles screamed in agony. She forced her eyes open. Instead of the sweeping panoramic view of the Seattle skyline from her multi-million-dollar penthouse, she saw a water-stained ceiling and exposed wooden beams. She was lying on a lumpy couch that smelled faintly of motor oil and pine needles. Where am I memory hit her like a freight train. The winding mountain road. The sudden, terrifying realization that the brake pedal was completely dead, the way the steering wheel had locked. The sickening crunch of metal, the smell of gas, the darkness. It hadn't been an accident. Vivian was the 28-year-old CEO of Mercer Dynamics, a global logistics and tech conglomerate worth over $6 billion. She had recently uncovered a massive embezzlement ring within her own company, a conspiracy that led directly to Richard Whitmore, her chief operating officer. And her fiancé. She had been driving to a secluded family cabin to review the encrypted hard drives containing the proof when her brakes mysteriously vanished. Richard had kissed her forehead before she left. "Drive safe, Viv," he had whispered. Panic spiked in her chest. If she was alive, whoever rigged her car would come to finish the job. "Hey, easy." Vivian flinched, snapping her head toward the voice. Standing in the doorway of a small, cramped kitchen was a tall, broad-shouldered man with exhausted brown eyes. He held a mug of steaming coffee. Next to his leg stood a pale little girl with dark, curly hair, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "You're safe," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You were in a bad wreck last night." Route 20. I pulled you out before the car caught fire. The roads are washed out, so I brought you here. Vivian stared at him, her sharp mind analyzing every detail. The worn flannel, the calloused, grease-stained hands, the genuine concern in his eyes. He wasn't one of Richard's men. He was a civilian. Who are you? Vivian managed her voice, a raspy whisper. Thomas Reed. This is my daughter Maya. Maya waved shyly. Vivian tried to sit up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her ribs. I wouldn't move much, Thomas warned, stepping forward. You've got 3 cracked ribs and a mild concussion. I stitched up your forehead, but you need a real hospital as soon as the road's clear. What's your name? Vivian hesitated. She couldn't tell him the truth. If Richard was looking for her, anyone associated with Vivian Mercer was a dead man walking. To protect herself, and to protect this man and his daughter, she had to become a ghost. Sarah. She lied smoothly, swallowing the lump in her throat. My name is Sarah. Do you have family I can call Sarah, anyone who's expecting you? Thomas asked. No, she said, looking down. No one. Thomas nodded, slowly accepting it. Over the next 2 days the storm raged on, keeping them completely isolated. Vivian watched Thomas closely. She was a CEO. Evaluating people was her superpower. She quickly realized that Thomas Reed was drowning. She watched him skip dinner, claiming he wasn't hungry, just so Maya could have a full bowl of stew. She saw him secretly counting out pennies and quarters from a jar to pay for Maya's expensive asthma inhalers. One afternoon, while Thomas was outside chopping wood, Vivian limped over to the kitchen counter and saw a stack of red-stamped envelopes. Seattle Children's Hospital. Final notice, $42,500. Pacific Heritage Bank. Foreclosure imminent. This man had nothing. He was losing his home. His daughter was critically ill. And yet he hadn't hesitated to risk his life to pull a stranger from a burning car. He had surrendered his bed, his food, and his time to keep her alive. Vivian felt a profound, unfamiliar tightness in her chest. In her world, every favor came with a contract. Here, kindness was just given, even when it cost everything. On the 3rd day, the rain finally stopped. The radio announced that crews were clearing the debris on Route 20, though passage was still limited. Thomas went into the small local town, a rusted outpost called Oak Haven, to buy groceries and get Maya's prescription refilled. He told Vivian to lock the doors and rest. Inside the Oak Haven diner, Thomas sat at the counter, waiting for a to-go order of chicken soup. The TV mounted in the corner was playing the national news. The anchor's voice cut through the diner's chatter. Tragedy in the corporate world today. Vivian Mercer, the brilliant 28-year-old CEO of Mercer Dynamics, is presumed dead after a horrific car accident on State Route 20. Authorities found her burned-out vehicle at the bottom of a ravine, but due to severe weather, a body has not been recovered. Richard Whitmore, the company's COO, has been named interim CEO and addressed the press earlier this morning. Thomas stared at the screen. A glamorous photo of the missing billionaire flashed beside the anchor. The sharp cheekbones, the piercing green eyes. Thomas's blood ran cold. Sarah. Before he could process the shock, the diner door chimed open. 2 men walked in. They wore expensive tailored black suits that looked entirely alien in the rural diner. They didn't look like cops, and they certainly didn't look like locals. They moved with the predatory grace of ex-military contractors. One of the men, sporting a thick scar across his jaw, approached the diner's waitress. He pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket. "Excuse me," the scarred man said, his voice slick and cold. "We're private investigators hired by a grieving family. There was a bad crash up on the pass 3 nights ago. We're looking for any sign that the driver might have survived. Has anyone in town mentioned taking in a stray, an injured woman?" Thomas froze. His coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the subtle, unnatural bulge under the scarred man's suit jacket. A shoulder holster. These weren't investigators looking to bring a loved one home. These were hitmen looking to finish a job. The waitress shook her head. "No, mister. Roads have been completely blocked. Nobody's come down from the mountain." The scarred man's eyes slowly swept across the diner, stopping on Thomas. Thomas was wearing his work jacket, the name Reed Towing stitched on the breast. The man walked over, standing uncomfortably close to Thomas's stool. "You're a tow truck driver. You out on the roads the night of the storm." Thomas slowly turned his head. His heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained a mask of blue-collar exhaustion. He thought of the terrified, broken billionaire sitting in his cabin. He thought of the gun under this man's coat. Thomas lied smoothly, his voice gruff. "Blew a tire near mile 30. Barely made it back before the bridge washed out. Wish I had seen the crash. Could have used the salvage fee." The scarred man stared at Thomas for a long, suffocating moment, searching for a crack in the lie. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "If you hear anything, call this number. There's a $50,000 reward." He dropped a sleek black business card on the counter. The men left. Thomas looked down at the card. It was blank, except for a phone number. He didn't grab his soup. He bolted for his truck. The conspiracy was real, and the killers were less than 5 miles from his daughter. The siege in the pines. Thomas didn't bother to park the tow truck carefully. He slammed it into park, leaving the engine idling, and sprinted up the muddy steps of the cabin. He burst through the front door, chest heaving. Vivian was standing by the wood stove pouring a cup of tea. Maya was on the rug, coloring in a worn book. "Maya, honey," Thomas said, his voice tight but controlled. "Go to your room. Pack your backpack with your favorite things. We're going on a trip." Maya looked up, sensing the urgency in her father's tone. She didn't argue. She grabbed her stuffed rabbit and scurried down the short hallway. As soon as the bedroom door clicked shut, Thomas turned to the woman he had saved. He crossed the small room in 3 strides, his imposing frame towering over her. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified, which was infinitely worse. "Vivian Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. Vivian stiffened. The mug trembled in her hand, spilling hot tea onto the floorboards. The lie she had carefully constructed dissolved instantly under his piercing gaze. "You saw the news," she whispered, her shoulders slumping. "I saw 2 professional killers in town asking about a missing woman." Thomas shot back, moving to the hall closet and pulling out a heavy canvas duffel bag. He unzipped it and began throwing in basic medical supplies, a flashlight and a heavy iron tire iron. "They have guns. They have a description of my truck. And they are less than 10 minutes away. Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because if I told you, you would be an accessory to whatever Richard is planning," Vivian pleaded, stepping toward him, wincing as her cracked ribs protested. "He's my COO. He embezzled over $200 million through offshore dummy corporations. I found the paper trail. I was driving to my family's secure estate to review the hard drives when my brakes failed. Thomas, if they know I'm alive, they won't just kill me. They'll kill you and Maya, too." Thomas stopped packing. He looked at the brilliant, broken billionaire standing in his living room. She wasn't an arrogant executive. She was a desperate woman who had been betrayed by the man she loved. "Go get Maya," Thomas ordered, zipping the bag. "We're taking the logging roads out the back of the mountain. They won't know those trails." But it was too late. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel echoed outside. Thomas lunged for the window, peering through a crack in the blinds. A black mud-splattered SUV had just parked at the end of his long driveway, blocking the only exit for the tow truck. The two men in tailored suits stepped out. The scarred man pulled a suppressed pistol from beneath his jacket, screwing a long silencer onto the barrel. "They're here!" Thomas hissed. He grabbed Vivian by the arm and shoved her toward the hallway. "Get in the bathroom with Maya. Get in the cast-iron tub, and keep your heads down. Do not come out until I tell you. Thomas, they'll kill you." Vivian cried, her eyes wide with terror. "I survived a tour in Kandahar." Thomas growled, his eyes darkening, with a fierce, primal protective instinct. "They're in my house now. Go." Vivian scrambled down the hall, grabbing Maya and pulling the terrified little girl into the small bathroom. Thomas killed the cabin lights, plunging the living room into heavy shadows. He crouched behind the thick oak kitchen island, gripping the heavy tire iron. His breathing slowed. His military training, dormant for years, flooded his veins with icy calm. The front door handle rattled. A heavy boot kicked the wood, splintering the frame. The door burst open, and the scarred man stepped inside, his weapon raised, sweeping the dark room. His partner flanked him, moving with tactical precision. "Check the back rooms," the scarred man whispered to his partner. As the second man stepped past the kitchen island, Thomas struck. He didn't hesitate. He swung the tire iron with crushing force, catching the man squarely behind the knee. The hitman let out a muffled grunt as his leg snapped, dropping to the floor. Before he could raise his weapon, Thomas delivered a devastating blow to the man's temple, knocking him out cold. The scarred man spun around, firing 2 silenced shots. Port, port. The bullets shattered the ceramic tiles inches from Thomas's face. Thomas lunged forward, tackling the scarred man around the waist. They crashed through the cheap wooden coffee table, splintering it into 100 pieces. The hitman was strong, driving an elbow into Thomas's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding under the sofa. The hitman drew a serrated combat knife from his belt, slashing wildly. The blade caught Thomas's forearm, tearing through the flannel and drawing a deep line of blood. Thomas roared, ignoring the blinding pain. He grabbed the man's knife wrist with his left hand, using his right to drive a brutal, bare-knuckle punch into the man's throat. The scarred man gasped, his eyes bulging, as his airway crushed. Thomas twisted the knife out of the man's grip, pinning him to the floorboards. He slammed his fist down one more time, and the hitman went limp. Silence descended on the cabin, broken only by Thomas's heavy, ragged breathing and the steady drip of blood from his arm. He stood up, kicking the weapons away from the unconscious men. He walked down the hall and knocked gently on the bathroom door. "It's me. It's clear." Vivian opened the door, her eyes dropping to the blood soaking Thomas's sleeve. Maya buried her face in her father's good arm, trembling violently. "We can't stay here," Thomas said, wrapping a tight bandage around his bleeding arm. "These guys have a boss. When they don't check in, Richard will send more. Where are those hard drives?" "At my family's estate," Vivian said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "It's 40 miles north, over the ridge." "Then let's go finish this," Thomas said. The drive over the mountain ridge was a tense, silent journey. Navigating the treacherous logging roads without headlights, Thomas pushed the heavy tow truck to its limits, while Vivian held Maya close in the passenger seat. By dawn, they reached the secluded Mercer estate, a sprawling, modernist glass fortress built into the cliffs. Inside the heavily fortified sub-basement, Vivian accessed a biometric safe and pulled out a sleek titanium flash drive. "This is it," Vivian said, her eyes burning with cold resolve. Every offshore account, the embezzled funds, and the wire transfers to the hitmen. Knowing they couldn't trust the local authorities, Vivian contacted Arthur Pendleton, the director of the SEC's Enforcement Division, and her late father's closest confidant. 3 hours later, at a deserted private airstrip, Arthur took the drive from her hands. Richard is hosting a press conference at noon to declare you legally deceased and assume the CEO role permanently, Arthur warned grimly. Thomas placed a firm protective hand on Vivian's shoulder. I started this by pulling you out of the fire. I'm seeing it through. We finish it together. At precisely 12:15 p.m., the grand atrium of Mercer Dynamics was packed with flashing cameras, reporters, and the elite board of directors. Richard Whitmore stood at the podium, looking appropriately mournful in a dark, tailored suit. Vivian was the love of my life, he lied smoothly to the press. To ensure the stability of her legacy, I humbly accept the role of permanent Chief Executive Officer. I wouldn't start redecorating my office just yet, Richard. The sharp voice sliced through the applause like a razor. The cameras whipped around. Standing at the back of the atrium, flanked by armed federal agents and a bruised, grease-stained tow truck driver, was Vivian Mercer. A collective gasp echoed through the lobby. Richard's face drained of color, his polished mask shattering into sheer panic. "Vivian, you're alive." "No thanks to you," Vivian replied, walking down the center aisle like a predator. "Arthur, please inform my former fiancée why you're here." Arthur Pendleton stepped forward, flashing his federal badge. "Richard Whitmore, you are under arrest for massive corporate fraud embezzlement and the attempted assassination of Vivian Mercer." Panicking, Richard bolted, sprinting toward the revolving glass doors. He didn't make it 5 feet. Thomas stepped effortlessly into his path, grabbing Richard by his expensive lapels and slamming him violently against the marble wall. "That's for sending killers to my daughter's house," Thomas whispered, holding the squirming executive until the agents slapped the cuffs on him. 1 month later, Thomas sat completely numb in the waiting room of Seattle Children's Hospital. He held a receipt for Maya's incredibly successful open-heart surgery. The balance at the bottom read $0, paid in full by the Mercer Foundation. Vivian walked in, wearing a sharp white suit, completely healed. She sat beside him and handed over a thick leather folder. Inside were the deeds to a massive state-of-the-art auto restoration facility in downtown Seattle. "I bought Pacific Heritage Bank and fired the manager who kept harassing you." Vivian smiled warmly. "And I bought you a shop. You saved my life, Thomas. You gave me my company back. Now it's my turn to give you your life back." If this story of unexpected heroism and billionaire justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Thomas risked his life for a stranger and changed his daughter's destiny forever. What would you do in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this incredible true-to-life drama with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories of survival, justice, and redemption.